Let's start in December of 1873. The Texas Capitol was the site of an armed standoff over a contested election. The incumbent Republican governor, Edmund J. Davis, lost his reelection bid to Democrat Richard Koch. It wasn't all that close, but both sides accused the other of fraud and intimidation. Lawsuits were filed. A man in Houston was accused of voting twice. The Texas Supreme Court stepped in and invalidated the entire election based on the placement of a semicolon in the then operative Texas Constitution of 1869. That court is forever known to history as the Semicolon Court. And based on that decision, Governor Davis refused to leave office. An armed standoff between militias supporting both candidates took place in the halls of the old Capitol. Davis and his supporters barricaded themselves into the governor's office, and the militia supporting Governor Koch broke into the building and swore him in on the House floor. And for 2 days, Texas had 2 governors. Governor Davis looked to the federal government for assistance, and President Ulysses S. Grant telegrammed back, "Would it not be prudent as well as right to yield to the verdict of the people as expressed by their ballots?" With no help coming from the federal government, Governor Davis stood down and Governor Koch took office, and Reconstruction effectively ended in Texas. There's nothing new under the sun, is there? We keep hearing the term unprecedented thrown around a lot recently, but our current moment is completely precedented. We'd like to tell you that things got better after the armed standoff in 1873, but they didn't. By 1900, once again, it looked like the world's first experiment with representational democracy was not going to survive. Social Darwinism became the dominant political and legal philosophy of the day. It argued that the rich were rich because they were superior, that they were the smartest and the strongest, and had therefore risen to the top through natural selection. The poor were poor because they were inferior and deserved whatever they got. The society as a whole valued selfishness and cutthroat competition, and any government intervention to change that quote unquote natural order was declared unconstitutional. Eugenics was a popular pseudoscience of the day. Former slaves were re-enslaved through legal devices like apprenticeship, black codes, Jim Crow, and convict labor. Europe had a human migration crisis. And as the number of immigrants in the United States climbed to numbers similar to what we have today, xenophobia became rampant against these so-called hyphenated Americans. The social fabric was completely frayed. Government was for sale. The gap between rich and poor had never been higher. People were socially disconnected as new technologies displaced and forever transformed societies and families. And people were even more polarized than they are today. In 1877, the Great Upheaval shut down all commerce across the United States in a coordinated labor strike that was then violently put down by state governments. Thereafter, labor strikes were routinely violent. In a coordinated effort, owners would hire private security firms like the Pinkertons, and they would infiltrate these demonstrations in order to start violence. The violence provided the pretext for the state government to then step in and use their police powers to break the strike. During this period, there was also a disputed presidential election in 1876. Ultimately, the House of Representatives made a deal to end Reconstruction, and Rutherford B. Hayes became president in January of 1877. Later in this period, in 1901, anarchists assassinated one of our presidents. And the United States Supreme Court was a complete lost cause. They set legal precedents that the legal community to this very day are still trying to get around. The US Supreme Court overturned the Civil Rights Act of 1875, which necessitated a civil rights movement 90 years later. The Supreme Court ruled that women were not allowed to vote, which necessitated a suffrage movement that would not be successful for another 50 years. The Supreme Court ruled that child labor laws were unconstitutional, including those that state and local governments had passed. The Supreme Court also ruled that forced sterilization of, quote, imbeciles, morons, and the feeble-minded were perfectly okay. That's from the opinion Buck versus Bell. It's still case law on the books and has never been overruled. This is a picture of Carrie Buck, for whom the Supreme Court wrote, and I quote from the actual opinion, 3 generations of imbeciles is enough. By contrast, historians call 1900 to 1920 the Progressive Era. There is no New Deal to get us out of the Depression in the 30s, and there is no Great Society or Civil Rights Movement in the 1960s, but for the groundwork done in this era. Nowadays, progressives, the word progressive gets thrown around to the point that it almost has no meaning. Here's what it actually means, and here's how I'll be using it. Progressivism is the compelling desire to reverse the downward drift of our nation and a belief in the power of ordinary citizens to do so. And that is exactly what happened. So let's spend the rest of our time talking about how they did it. 1, they voted. 2, they served institutions of democracy. 3, they associated. 4, they formed communities. 5, they evangelized. 6, they were incrementalist. And 7, they were persistent. There was no one party, no one policy, no one platform. They pulled the nation off the track to disintegration because countless citizens engaged in a myriad of tiny little ways in their own spheres of influence. It was not inevitable. It was more like a religious awakening. And it's why religious groups like the Methodist Church, for instance, own prime real estate across the street from the US Capitol and next door to the US Supreme Court. Ordinary citizens doubled down on their commitment to our democratic institutions, and they figured out that national leadership comes after sustained, widespread citizen engagement at a state and local level, not before. They built issue-based grassroots organizations at a national, state, and local level. They then injected their issues into the primaries of both political parties. They lobbied these local and state elected officials, and then they voted every single time. So let's start with some really good news. In 2020, for the first time in Texas history, a majority of the voting age population turned out to vote. Think about that for a second. Before 1970, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 had not fully been implemented. And before the 19th Amendment, half the population was excluded based just on gender. Our modern democracy is only as old as 1965. And in 2020, for the very first time, we hit 52% of the voting age population participating in an election. That's the good news. Here's the bad news. 48%, or nearly half of Texas's voting age population, did not bother. 1 in 5 Texans are not registered. And next year in 2022, we could hope that maybe 40% or 2 in 5 Texans will vote. But more than likely, it won't be like 2018. It'll be more like 2010 or 2014, where it's usually about 1 in 4 Texans, or 25%, that vote in a midterm or gubernatorial year. But November isn't even the election that 95% of the Texas legislature is most worried about. 95% of the Texas legislature is effectively decided in the March primaries. While it's getting better, better means that 13% of the voting age population in Texas participates in a primary, as opposed to the 10% that we were seeing at the beginning of the 1910s. And if a primary goes to a runoff, you end up with roughly 5% of the state participating. So let's talk about two notable recent runoffs that are very much worth talking about. In 2012, 650,000 Texans out of 1.1 million voted for U.S. Senator Ted Cruz. That's roughly about 3% of the voting age population. The next election cycle in 2014, it was lower. About 450,000 Texans out of about 750,000 total voted for Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick. That's roughly 2.5% of the voting age population. So if you do not like how things are going in Texas right now, then I must tell you that there are less than 1 million super voters that are setting the agenda in Texas because they are more committed than you. Voting is the bare minimum that you can do to preserve democracy. If you do not vote, you matter to God, but you do not matter to the Texas legislature. The time to get started on 2022 is right now. A voter registration drive in September of 2022 is too late. You need to plan right now for a voter registration drive in September of 2021, or be ready to hit the ground running as soon as the vaccine is adequately distributed in your faith community. Step 2, serve the institutions of democracy. So let's talk about the F word for a second, fraud. There was no systemic or significant fraud in any way affecting the outcome of the election. Period. Anything to the contrary is just not true. Don't take our word for it. Take the word of 60 different federal judges. Why do I say systemic? Well, because in all of Pennsylvania, there were 3 cases. All 3 were supporters of the past administration. Now, you may have seen that our Lieutenant Governor Patrick put up a bounty of $1 million for people to come forward with cases of voter fraud. Well, the Lieutenant Governor of Pennsylvania has come forward, and now he wants to get paid for those 3 cases. And he's been trolling Dan Patrick Lieutenant Governor Patrick on Twitter for months now. He's even printed up t-shirts that say hashtag where's our money? And if you don't want to believe Lieutenant Governor of Pennsylvania because he's a Democrat, fine. Let's talk about Georgia. The Republican Secretary of State, who has had death threats and more pressure put on him than a South African diamond, has said on 60 Minutes that there were a total of 12 instances. 12. And they should all be investigated and prosecuted. But if I owe you $10,000 and I give you a $10 bill, do you feel like I am anywhere near paying you back? Let's use some common sense, folks. There are 10,000 polling locations just in Texas alone. Each location has at least 4 people, a judge, an alternate judge of a different political party, and 2 clerks. So that's 40,000 people just in the 10,000 polling locations. Then factor in all the county employees, the clerk, the administrators, the local voter registrar, the IT people, the trainers, the tabulators, the vote by mail counters, who, by the way, are also election judges equally appointed from lists provided by both parties. And oh, by the way, there's the county sheriff who has personnel present at all the vote counting centers. And then you have the partisan poll watchers, which should not be confused with the nonpartisan nonprofit poll monitors. And then you have the Secretary of State and all those employees monitoring the counties. And then after election day, you have the canvass, which spot checks and audits to make sure that the election was accurate. Yeah, that many unrelated people with eyes watching the process all missed some, big secret conspiracy that some guy who writes a blog post on the website found. Horse hockey. And if you still must see to believe, then go down to your county and be an election judge. Actually serve your county before spreading baseless beliefs that are undermining your country. The local elections administrators are the real heroes of 2020. It's the thousands of election administrators and their staff from both parties who have been under the face of death threats just for doing their jobs that preserved our democracy. If you want to double down on your commitment to democracy, make a plan to be an election judge in 2022. Because how we get out of this mess is person by person. When someone in your Sunday school class uses the F word, fraud, you need to be able to call BS because you served as an election judge. You need your pastor to be able to tell the congregation what she saw, that she worked with the county, that she was an election judge, and this is what she saw. Now, you're not going to persuade the paranoid. That's not the goal. The goal was for your credibility to discredit theirs and reveal their lack of credibility. That keeps others from falling for the big lie. Step 3, associate. It is absolutely imperative that you do not try to do this work alone. Join something. Ideally, we'd suggest an issue-focused, nonpartisan grassroots organization or two. Next to the election apparatus itself, these are the next most important institutions to build up and preserve democracy. It is absolutely critical for ordinary citizens like you to become $40 members of grassroots organizations for at least 3 reasons. 1, we cannot wait around for philanthropy to write a big check. That's the situation that every grassroots organization is in right now. We're overly dependent on the meager resources bestowed to us from foundations. That chronic underfunding causes us to be siloed off from one another in our various reform efforts because we're competing with one another for the same resources. Second, having members makes an organization authentic. I am a big believer in membership organizations for this reason. We are not a front for a wealthy donor or a political party. We are ordinary, everyday citizens. And third, history supports the efficacy of membership organizations, but the very best ones were issue-oriented, not partisan. In the 1880s, the robber baron Jay Gould would say, I'm a Republican in a Republican district, a Democrat in a Democratic district, but I'm always for the Erie Railroad. Well, by 1900, progressives figured this out. And they did it better because voters always beat money in a democracy, so long as those voters are engaged and paying attention. By 1920, progressives had done one of the hardest things to achieve in American politics, not once, but 4 times. They amended the US Constitution. I cannot overstate how truly remarkable that is. Even a civil war only caused it to be amended 3 times. So let's take the prohibitionist as an example. They didn't care if somebody was a Republican or a Democrat. They only cared if they were wet or if they were dry. So let's take the Women Christian Temperance Union. At the end of my career, I hope I am not remembered for my one big bad idea. In this case, they have the name temperance in their name, so they're forever linked with prohibition. But we really should not forget that they created teenagers as we now know them. They championed child labor laws, compulsory education requirements, and age of consent laws, and the formation of high schools for both genders. There is no Beatlemania in the 1960s, but for the Women Christian Temperance Union. There's a reason that both political parties had progressive wings. Teddy Roosevelt was a progressive Republican and Woodrow Wilson a progressive Democrat. And that was true from the presidency on down to the local level. In fact, really, it was true at a local level and filtered up to the presidency. And there is zero reason that this can't happen again. One of the things I really like about working for mainline Protestants and the emerging interfaith communities that are the membership of Texas Impact is that our congregations are not partisan, nor are they homogenous. Texas Impact ran our database of 22,000 members against the voter file. And we found out that 38% of you vote in primaries. That's not where we'd like it, but it's still 4 times better than the state average. Of those who do, 50% of you vote in the Democratic primary, 42% of you vote in the Republican primary, and 8% of you have a mixed primary history. Now, this has its challenges, but we're never shut out. I cannot understate the importance of primaries and the importance of organizing to inject the issues you care about into those primaries. So for those that have been watching, have you noticed that support for public schools is a giant fault line in the Republican primary? And there is no reason that this can't be true for other issues as well. For example, expanding Medicaid. The same arguments apply to expanding Medicaid that pertain to public schools, especially in rural areas where hospitals are closing and businesses don't want to relocate there because of it. Expanding Medicaid could be a progressive Republican issue in rural areas if we do the work. And in the urban areas, let's see what happens with LGBTQ rights and non-discrimination in the Texas House this session. If either of these things happen, then it's going to be on us who ask for that vote to then support their vote when they come back home. This may mean crossing over from your preferred political party that you vote for in November to support that vote in March. It just depends on where you live. But how are you going to know any of this if you aren't associated with a grassroots organization? Local newspapers are understaffed or out of business, and a state representative very rarely makes news. At a minimum, you need to be getting the email updates and action alerts from groups like us. Better if you call your representative when the action alert asks you to do so. Even better than that is if you join our rapid response team. Now, rapid response is a list that Scott activates when a phone call needs to be made right away. And we need people that we can count on to do it right at that moment within 24 hours. That rapid response list has bottled up some really bad bills and has forced amendments on some other bills. Even better than rapid response, if you want to take that next step, listen to Weekly Witness. It's our podcast so that you can then inform others about what's going, others in your community about what's going on at the state capitol. And finally, when you're ready and able, join a legislative engagement group. There is no super secret lobby strategy for how to do this work in a COVID-19 session. It's just not a good idea to be in the building, not just for our health, but do you think that those poor staff that have to be in the building really want to take an in-person meeting? But that means that I can't just plop down in an office until the staff we need is available to talk. We can't stalk state legislators between the floor and a committee hearing. We aren't really sure how to even do committees. We're just figuring that out this week and next week. There's no bumping into a lobbyist or a staffer in the hallway or in the cafeteria to find out what might have changed overnight. We are going to have to rely on you as a constituent for access in a way that we've never had to do before. It's always been important. It's triply important this time around. I do have some good news. The legislators and their staff are a lot more responsive to constituents than I have seen in the 15 years of doing this work, especially when those constituents are coming through a grassroots organization. Now, this has been a trend for a while, and we're getting to the busy part of session. If you start to bump into some of that, know that that's the moment of session we're getting into, and that their attention spans and frankly, the minutes in their day are becoming short. But we have observed that it's really escalated this year in a way that we hadn't seen before. I don't have a great explanation other than we think it's a lot like that Mr. Rogers episode where he tells the kids that when things are scary in the news to look for the helpers. And I could not be more honored at a time like this to work for an organization that's known as one of the helpers. Which brings me to step 4, community. The way the progressive era Americans pulled themselves out of the Gilded Age was town by town, county by county, state by state. It came from the bottom up. Do you like having your trash picked up? Do you like indoor plumbing? Do you like the appliances made possible through electricity coming to your house? Do you like knowing that the wiring of your house shouldn't burn it down, or that a pipe shouldn't freeze and explode because there's a building code? Do you like that there are high schools? All of these things we take for granted, but they were local innovations of the progressive era. And true policy innovation requires an openness to experimentation that is not premised upon ideological beliefs. So this session, the attacks by the state legislature on local governments are expected to continue. I urge you not to get distracted by whether you like or dislike a particular policy in question. Whether it's plastic bag bans or backyard oil wells or paid sick leave or the minimum wage or payday lending regulations or police reform. Here's what every state attack on local government has in common. They want to take away your vote and your voice as a local voter. That's not the American way. If we do not allow for policy innovation at a local level, then a policy's efficacy or failure will not be proven. And I kind of wonder if that's exactly the concern. 100 years ago, locals voted to raise their own taxes, to expand education to what we now call high school kids. The result was a huge economic return on investment, and the idea spread like wildfire across the United States. America outcompeted other nations economically because of it. So despite the howlings of the robber barons about liberty of contract and the right to work, it turns out that having kids in high school instead of in the factory was good for business. But now, once again, modern day robber barons are focused on themselves. It is hard to explain Snowvid in any other way. So what is often referred to as a deregulated market for electricity is really the result of a regulatory policy choice. The bill number was Senate Bill 7 in 1999. Letting them call it a deregulated market allows them to abdicate their responsibility for it. This was a legislative policy choice. The legislature is responsible for choosing to do what is now, the legislature is responsible for choosing what a now infamous company called Enron wanted them to do, which was deregulation of the electric market. Here's another legislative policy choice. We do not properly regulate or enforce against the construction industry because of 2 decades of heavy advocacy by the industry through lobbying and consultants and campaign contributions and all the usual methods. This is a picture of my friend's kitchen. They had just remodeled it and discovered the hard way that the contractor had not insulated the pipes that were rerouted over their ceiling. So when the power went off and the pipes burst, this was the result. The contractor makes off without any consequences, and we all socialize that cost through our homeowners insurance premiums. It's like we've learned nothing from 2008 and Too Big to Fail. For 2 decades, we've been fed this narrative about the Texas miracle. No taxes, no regulation, open for business. It sounded good, and for a moment, it looked real. But with Snowvid getting not just national, but international attention, do we really think businesses want to move to a place that can't handle an average snow day in Michigan? We couldn't keep the heat on. Children froze to death in their homes. We couldn't provide drinking water. Homes literally collapsed on top of people. And meanwhile, the state Senate's top priorities for this session are new bathroom bills and some star-spangled nonsense. Who wants to relocate there? We have to discipline ourselves to turn off the cable news networks and spend some time on our state and local governments. For instance, who is the county chair of your favorite political party right now? Who is your county commissioner? Who's your city council member? Who's your sheriff or police chief? What are the policies they're working on? Watching the legislature is a full-time job. There is no way that Texas Impact can cover 1,100 municipalities in 254 counties. And even if we could, we wouldn't be a part of that community. Your community needs you to be experts on the needs of your community. The good news is your local church probably has some idea about those needs. And if not, then here's where you need to start. Texas Impact has a guide for local congregations that will help you assess the needs of your community so that you can better decide where to focus your mission programs. Just Google Texas Impact Treasure Hunt. It looks like this. Your community needs you in a legislative engagement group. So the way legislative districts are gerrymandered, especially in urban areas, it may be a little weird to think about your House district as a community. Nevertheless, that's exactly what they are. They are communities of interest. That's a legal term of art. Now, we're innovating with our legislative engagement groups. Frankly, we know some of you really can't stand your representative and you really don't want to go to a meeting with him or her. We know this because you've told us. We hear you. We also know some of you really can't do a weekly meeting. We hear that too. Nevertheless, we think the legs are still a place for you. We are working on making these teams of people. Your community needs you on the team. Others will go to the meeting if that's not for you. These teams need some folks working on finding better representation if that's where you're so called. But to be deeply concerned with the needs of the community requires a both-and approach. It needs present-oriented pragmatists that are good at making lemonade out of lemons. And it also needs future-oriented folks looking for better fruit. It's both and, it's not either or. And because news media outlets really can't tell you much about your state rep, there is no substitute for engaging with your state House member and then communicating with others about that engagement. Which brings me to step 5, evangelize. Democracy is about addition, not subtraction. We need a big tent. No matter how outraged you think you are, if you cannot find 5 friends to go vote or to join an organization, then you aren't really serious. It's just like church. People do not magically appear one Sunday. We have to quit waiting for people to volunteer. They have to be recruited. And like discipleship, it's going to have a cost. After 2020, I don't think I need to explain the pain of broken relationships with friends and family. Nor do we have a solution for that pain. But we would encourage you to dust off your sandals and press on. Don't be distracted from the work, or all the pain is for nothing. Which brings me to step 2 of evangelism. We aren't just inviting people into the tent, but we need to be building a bigger one. If our policy proposals are not palatable, if the things we are saying don't make sense, then we need to know why. So for example, let's take the issue of Medicaid expansion. If our talking points are trying to pull on the heartstrings by focusing on the uninsured children, and our friends in the legislature privately say to me, Josh, I care about children too, but that is off-putting and preachy. It's not helping because we also have this budget we have to balance. Okay, then we're stupid if we don't listen to that and we just keep talking to the already converted. Having those relationships are critical because sometimes you have the right message. It's just bad timing. We heard some of that on the last presentation, or a couple presentations ago. And you won't know that without the ability to have a conversation. So let's take Medicaid expansion again. It's been baffling to those of us working on this issue for over a decade. I mean, who wouldn't like lower property taxes and lower insurance premiums? And it was through our conversation with our conservative friends that encouraged us to keep on this message. They explained that the message of fiscal responsibility was indeed the right message, but our timing was just bad politically, because a rival faction in their party was running against all things related to Obamacare. But they also wanted the truth to prevail. And the truth is that the economic activity would generate new revenues to offset any state expenditure and also enable local governments to lower property taxes. We've stayed on it and pressed on. And a decade later, we're at least having the conversation again. Which brings me to step 6, incrementalism. Expanding Medicaid does not solve 5 million Texans uninsured, but it does solve the problem for 1 million. Progressives 100 years ago were multi-issue incrementalists. If you look at the broad range of issues they were working on, let's just tick them off. Universal health care, safety nets for the elderly, the jobless, and the disabled, progressive income tax and estate taxation, environmental regulations, labor reform, curtailing monopoly power, gender equality, campaign finance reform. Did they fix all those things? No. Did they move the ball down the field? Absolutely. They were pragmatists that accepted slow and steady reform. Which brings us to step 7, resilience and persistence. Incrementalism requires commitment. You've got to be in it for the long game. Imagine being Anna Howard Shaw as a young college student and reading in your local newspaper that the US Supreme Court had ruled that the Constitution had to be amended for you to get the right to vote. Then imagine you spent 4 decades of your professional career fighting for the equal right to vote. And then you pass away 1 month before the 19th Amendment was ratified. Or imagine being Ida B. Wells, who was the original Rosa Parks. She was drug off a train at 22 years old for refusing to give up her seat. And then she watched the US Supreme Court gut the Civil Rights Act of 1875. It didn't get better for her. Her friends were lynched. And she started a newspaper which investigated and documented lynchings for the next 4 decades. She helped found the NAACP, but she did not live to see any of Thurgood Marshall's legal successes, to see Rosa Parks keep her seat, or the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Or imagine Frances Perkins, who before she was the first female cabinet secretary under FDR, watched 146 women burn alive in the Triangle Shirt Fire because the owners of the building wouldn't install a fire escape and the legislature was too indifferent to make them. She realized at that moment that no amount of charity would ever remedy the greed or indifference. But she was never free to be open about who it was she really loved. Now I'm about to show a slide that comes with a trigger warning. For our African American brothers and sisters, the Confederate flag is traumatizing. But I need to talk to my fellow white Americans for a moment. The biggest failure of white progressives 100 years ago was their racism. And we're still living with that failure. This next photo comes from the Atlantic magazine, who rightly called this photo the whole story of the insurrection in a single photo. I show it because we are still living in an unreconstructed nation. 12 and 5 years ago, we brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all humans are created equal. And just like those who walked across the Edmund Pettus Bridge, who liberated concentration camps or demanded the right to vote, it is our turn to be tested as to whether this nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. It is for us to continue the unfinished work for which so many Americans have fought, so that government of the people, by the people, and for the people shall not perish from the earth. Thanks be to God.